Dear friends, welcome to the Priest Podcast, sponsored by the Napa Institute. You may not know it, but one of Napa's most meaningful efforts involves the formation and support of priests and religious. We have become fascinated by the stories of our clergy. Through this podcast, we want to bring you some of these amazing stories too, but in a way that is unique, priests interviewing other priests from all walks of life and backgrounds. We think this series will be a great resource for everyone, those considering the priesthood, as well as those in active ministry who may be struggling or just looking for good ideas. But even the laity will benefit by learning more about the needs and thoughts of the clergy as we consider how to support and pray for them, given all they do for us. So sit back and enjoy this glimpse into the life and work of the priest.
Hello, everyone. I'm Msgr Roger Landry, today's host for the Shepherd's Circle Priest Podcast, produced by the Napa Institute. I am so delighted this afternoon to welcome Msgr Christopher Nalty, a priest of the Archdiocese of New Orleans, pastor of the Basilica of St. Stephen in New Orleans, and pastor likewise of Good Shepherd Parish there, which includes other churches that we'll have a chance to talk about. He was ordained a priest on July 3rd, 1999, and since has served in various assignments in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, as well as for the Vatican at the Congregation for Clergy. I'm excited to hear him speak about his priestly experiences. Msgr Christopher Nalty, welcome to the Shepherd's Circle Priest Podcast.
Happy to be with you, Msgr Landry.
So we always begin with the vocation story of a priest. When he began to think about the priesthood, what was the preparation prior to his entering seminary? And I know you have quite a story that's been written up in books and articles. So can you walk us through how God drew you to serve him at the altar?
Well, I think, obviously I grew up in a very devout Catholic family. My parents were involved in the church from early on in their marriage in terms of marriage preparation. My dad was in the first class of permanent deacons in the Archdiocese of New Orleans. So I was an altar server, from the time I could do it until I went away to college, into high school, and even in a little high school. And the thing about my parents is they never pushed me in any direction. They wanted me to really find and explore my own vocation. And so that gave me a lot of freedom. But to be honest, as a young man, I really saw my dad as my model. And my dad as a lawyer, there are 5 children in our family, raising children. That's just how I saw myself because of my great admiration for my father. And it wasn't until my second year of law school that I was dating a girl for a long time. We broke up. I wanted to talk to someone. My dad recommended his spiritual director, who was a priest and at the time was the rector of the seminary. And at that point on, I was actively thinking about seminary, but I'd already gone through almost 2 years of law school. I did a JD MBA. And so I was still on that path. And it was hard to get me off of that path. My parents had invested a lot in my education. And so I continued to graduate from law school, and I took a job at a big law firm here in New Orleans. And but it kept coming back. The vocation kept coming back. And after I'd successfully suppressed the idea of a vocation for about 8 years, I finally got to the point where I said, you can just think about this for the rest of your life, or you can give it a shot. And it was almost a logical decision on my part. I mean, at least the way that I explained it to people. Now, there were a lot of things that happened along the way that were God's working in my life. And perhaps, he wanted me to be a late vocation like St. Peter, St. Andrew, St. John, St. James, other people who had done all the work. And a lot of my parishioners do think that was good because I have experience in the world that helps me break down the gospel and give it to them, and helps me when they have crises in their own worldly life because I've gone through a lot of that.
So you went to high school, Catholic schools in New Orleans as you were growing up?
Went to Jesuit high school in New Orleans. My dad said he would pay for me to go to college under 2 circumstances. One, it was Catholic. The other, it was outside of New Orleans. So I went to the University of Notre Dame. I was in pre-med for 2 years until I realized to be a doctor, you really have to want to be a doctor. You can't just fall into med school. And so I switched my major and eventually I studied administration and business, and then made my way to Georgetown for law school, a JD MBA, and graduated from there. Got a great job at a great firm. Bought a house, had a dog, all the things that young professionals did. I was dating. I came close to being married several times, but in the end of the day, after 25, 26 years of being a priest, you see God's hand in your life a lot clearer than you do when you're going through it. And so I can see God's hand. I'll give you one example. When I interviewed with the Archdiocese, one of the persons who interviewed me was a religious sister, a Carmelite. And she said, "Did you ever think about being a priest when you were younger?" And I said, "No, it wasn't until I was in law school." And she said, "Well, did you ever play priest when you were a kid?" And I went, "Yeah." And it was a memory that I didn't have. We would get these little mellow wafers, and we had them, and they looked like communion hosts, and I would play priest for my siblings and give them communion with these little mellow wafers. So the hand of God was there. It wasn't until later that you look back upon it and recognize it.
How much of a transition was it for you to go from serving as a lawyer and basically calling your own shots in life to applying to a seminary and then being accepted and making the transition into seminary and all of those adjustments?
I think that the, not calling my own shots wasn't really the issue. I think that one of the things that was hard is to start to be in seminary with a lot of people who are significantly younger than you. Without the experiences, and you don't have as many contact points. Fortunately, in our class, we had a number of people who were late vocations, or as they say in Italian, vocazioni ritardate, and retarded vocations. But I remember when our rector came in the first meeting I had with him, and he said, "How is it going?" And I said, "Well, it's kind of hard because as an attorney, I was dealing with clients who were 10 or 12 years older than me. And as a seminarian, my peers are 10 or 12 years younger than me. And that's like a generational change. And that went away fairly fast. But I think that the early part of vocational discernment, when you're early days in the seminary, you just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. God brought you there for a reason. You're going to go through hard things. And I never consciously ever thought about leaving. In fact, the first day I was in seminary, I did my philosophy in Washington, D.C. at Theological College. The first day I arrived there, some of the other seminarians saw me. We started talking. And they said, "Look, we're going to go pray Vespers together. Do you want to come?" And we're praying Vespers together. And I thought at that moment, this is where God wants me to be. And even through the struggles of vocational discernment after that, I never, ever consciously thought, I'm not going to make it. I just, you just have to keep plugging forward. And that's what I did.
And so then eventually you went to the North American College in the Vatican. I got to know you there. We were blessed to be classmates together. And you were one of the guys who brought all your classmates together through just your personality and being a person for others, as well as through your extraordinary capacity to cook and to host and to throw a New Orleans party wherever you are.
We Catholics, we all use food as bait, okay? In my parish, fish fries, spaghetti, we always use food as bait. And I enjoy cooking. I've always enjoyed cooking. And that really was a big part of our class and still is, dining together, sitting around a table, being in Rome for 10 years, you get back to the kind of an old style eating arrangement where you're not, eating and running, where you eat and then you sit around the table and you talk. And that's when great ideas come about, solving the world's problems. But also, now that we're older, all the old stories that we love to repeat about seminary and intervening years, but priestly fellowship is so important for priests. And it is hard to come back to your diocese where you don't have, only had two guys that were in my ordination class, and I was close to one of them, and he passed away right when I got here. He was the previous pastor of this parish. And so I rejoice that we have our annual reunions where we get together and lift each other up, and we can bounce ideas, especially since a lot of us are in different type of ministry, but there's always commonalities and questions and support that we can give each other.
During your years in seminary, who were the major influences in showing you the type of priest you would aspire to be, and what were the lessons you learned from them?
It's an interesting question. I mean, our rector, obviously, now Cardinal Timothy Dolan, was a huge part of our seminary experience. I think that as I grew into seminary, finding peers among people that were even younger than me was something very important, because there are a lot of the guys who'd been in formation longer than me, and I got thrown into the frying pan, and some guys had been in minor seminary, and they had in some ways a lot of deeper understanding of formation and a deeper understanding of the priesthood than I did. But maybe probably the most powerful active thing for me was just being in Rome. Rome is a great magister, a great teacher, and as you go around the city and you visit all of the places where great saints are buried, martyrs of the church, falling in love with the idea of martyrdom, which was something very foreign to us as Americans. We have a few martyrs in our country, but the North American martyrs, but to walk the places where martyrs were made, and especially at St. Peter's, was probably the biggest influence. I think it's like that in the world. You look and see where the church is growing the most, and a lot of it is in countries where there's a danger of martyrdom. If your faith makes you ready to accept martyrdom, you've got a strong faith right there. And living in a city of martyrs, I think, it's not that I was ever away from my faith, but it strengthens your faith, and seeing the church as universal, and meeting seminarians from all over the world, and some who went back to places where martyrdom is still occurring. That had a profound influence on me.
One of the ways that you spent a lot of your free time when you were a seminarian in Rome was as a guide to St. Peter's tomb, what we call the scavi, or the excavations. What type of an impact on your priesthood did leading thousands of people to St. Peter's tomb to pray there, to explain the basis in the historicity of our faith in Rome, what type of impact has that had on your 26 years as priest?
I mean, it's incalculable, really. And I still do them when I go over to Rome. They still allow me to lead the tours. I did for 5 years when I was working over there. But I remember the first time I went on that tour, people had been telling me, oh, you got to do the Scavi tour, you got to do the Scavi tour. I'm like, I'm not here to take tours and to visit churches. I'm here for my faith. And the very first time I went with our dear friend, Father Eric Burns, I looked at the end of the tour, I said, this is the reason we're here. We're here because Peter's here. And if Peter had been buried in Athens, we'd be in Athens. I mean, this is the reason. This is the whole purpose. And when you recount the stories of the martyrdoms that went on during the time of Nero, obviously Peter and Paul are prominent there. But the next day you have the Feast of the Holy Roman Martyrs, the rest of the unnamed people who were killed there. And I would always tell people at the end of the tour, you're in Rome right now and you're eating some great food and you're visiting some great sites. This is what it was like in Rome in the first century. It meant that you and your family were brought out into an arena and killed in terrible ways for your faith. And that rock of Peter is still here. And it had a profound influence on me, but because it had a profound influence on me, it had a profound influence on a lot of people that I brought down there. Lots of people who converted after their visits there, because that's the faith, that's the rock, and that's where it all started. So I think being in Rome for 10 years, Rome is almost like a second home for me. When I land at Fiumicino, it's like my Italian comes back. I still have friends around town, and I'm from New Orleans. This is my hometown, but Rome is easily a second home.
Anything in the same category as New Orleans for somebody coming from NOLA, that's a great compliment to the center of the ancient world. But you had to leave Rome and come back to your first love, which is New Orleans, to serve as a priest after you had finished a canon law degree in your studies. Your first year as a priest was in Rome, and then you returned to New Orleans. What was that transition back home like? What were your first assignments like?
Well, my first assignment was fabulous because I was an associate for one of the auxiliary bishops of New Orleans, Archbishop Bishop Dominic Carmen, and he was a great pastor for a new priest because he let you make mistakes. Okay, and I remember one time asking him. He said, "You're in charge of the Holy Thursday Mass for the washing of the feet," and I said, "Well, what do we do in this parish?" So I just took it and I left. And then I went back to him later. I said, "Well, do we wash men's feet or women's feet or both here?" And he says, "Well, previous associate had done men and women. Another one had just done men." And I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I just do men's feet." I said, "Thank you." Okay, so he let me figure things out, and I made some mistakes, but it was just a kind, gentle, faithful man, and I was so glad that I came back home to be in this parish before he passed away, because he was able to do some confirmations here, and he shared some memories of our time together with my parishioners, which is incredibly flattering to me.
And so you were there in Metairie was the place.
I was out in Kenner by the airport, and I was there for 3.5 years until I was sent back to work at the Congregation for the Clergy. And that was kind of a shock because, I remember when I was in canon law, and one of my professors, Monsignor Bocafola, took us to the Roman Rota to see where he worked. And I looked around at these wood-paneled walls and these desks and these books, and I thought, that is my worst nightmare. Because then what am I doing? I'm going from a lawyer with a house and a dog and a girlfriend to a lawyer without any of that and working on paperwork all day. And that isn't what I ever thought I would do as a priest. And so it was a little bit of a shock to the system, but you adapt to priestly ministry. One of the first things I remembered, that I think it was Charles Borromeo who said that he saw his desk as his cross. And so one of the first days at my time at the Congregation for the Clergy, I actually celebrated Mass on my desk. And it was a way of saying, okay, this is where my sacrifice is going to be. And you get used to it. It's very interesting work. I'm back in Rome, which I love. I remember that one of the first weeks I was in the office, and I'm walking down the hallway, and I hear this commotion outside, and I thought maybe there's some sort of a strike or manifestazione or something, and I look out the window, and it's because the Pope's there, and I'm like, well, that's kind of cool, that right in front of my office is the Pope, and so because my time in Rome developed a great love for the Church and the Holy Father. Being there during the papacy of now Pope St. John Paul II, to be there in the piazza when Pope Benedict, who I've seen many times in Rome, was elected, those are just indelible memories for me. And so, my time in Rome was special. And at the end of it, the bishop asked me what I wanted to do in a very interesting way. He said, how hard do you want me to work to bring you home? And the way I answered it is, I said, Archbishop, I said, if I say I want to go home and the Cardinal here makes me stay, it'll look like I didn't get what I want. And if I say I want to stay and you bring me home, it'll look like I didn't get what I want. And so I just want to do what the Church wants. And so the Archbishop Alfred Hughes at the time said, I'd like you back in the diocese. I said, great. And so he sent me into the diocese. And it was funny because he told me the summer before I was appointed, that where I would go, what my parish, and I knew all about the parish because the parish had filed appeals to the Congregation for the Clergy. And when I saw they were from New Orleans, I said, I can't work on these things. And he said, you can't tell anybody until it gets announced. And I said, well, can I tell my parents? He said, yeah. So I went home and my mom said, okay, where are you going? And I said, what do you think is the worst assignment in the Archdiocese of New Orleans? And my mother says, oh my gosh, you're going to St. Stephen's. And so it was a hugely challenging thing because the weekend before I arrived, the Archdiocese had shut two of the churches in my parish, had locked them. People broke in and started all-night vigils. It was highly publicized, even up to the New York Times, for 2 months. And then when I was on my annual retreat with my classmates, the Archdiocese chose that time to send the police in to arrest my parishioners. And so the first, I would say, 5 months were just incredibly stressful because I'm supposed to have care of these people. They're totally hurt from having their church closed. And how do I manage this? And thankfully, and this is no aspersion to Archbishop Hughes, he was getting advice from people who thought what was best for the Archdiocese. But shortly after our return, Archbishop Aymond was appointed. Archbishop Aymond is the first Archbishop of New Orleans who is a native New Orleanian. And he recognized that this was not something that was going to go away. And so he listened to me and gave me the tools to help my parishioners. And no mistake, it was I had to help them. But since then, since that difficult time, now Our Lady of Good Counsel is open. It's the Catholic Charismatic community lives there. But it's open for baptisms, weddings, funerals. St. Henry, which is only a block away from me, is open the same way. And so, and all the churches have been restored, and so it's good. And I'm glad that Archbishop Aymond listened to, instead of following a archdiocesan plan, what's the guy on the ground? What can he offer? And he definitely listened to me and my parishioners and our concerns. And in the end, it was, you get given lemonade, you make limoncello. So we made limoncello.
I'm talking with Monsignor Christopher Nalty of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. I want to stay there for a little while because many of the dioceses in the United States of America are experiencing church consolidations and the rest. You've already highlighted one lesson I think that everyone can learn, and that bishops and chanceries need to listen to the pastors on the ground and the people in those parishes. But what other lessons did you observe that might be of use to bishops, vicars general, clergy directors, and pastors and people across the country about how to approach the circumstances of decreased attendance and the other factors that go into the decision to merge parishes? What have you learned there that might be of use to others?
It's hard to say because I really think my situation was very unique. All the churches were together in a very close geographical area. The problem with closing parishes is you have dwindling numbers of priests and dwindling economic resources. We had some economic resources because they had closed one of our schools and it was being leased to a private school. And so we had some monthly income that could help with that. There's two aspects to it. One is just the number crunching of the numbers of Catholic, numbers of priests, numbers of dollars. And then there's the other side of it, which is three diverse communities and trying to bring them together. In a way, they were three diverse communities, but in this other sense, they were all New Orleanians and they didn't live that far away from each other. And so that wasn't as much of a deal. A lot of them knew each other, liked each other. But I'm not sure I could offer advice in terms of, I would say listen to your priest because Archbishop Aymond definitely listened to me. But sometimes I have to say it's unavoidable, and it's because of numbers of priests and parishioners and dollars, whether you can support 3 campuses. We were able to do it in my case, and I'm glad we did. I'm happy we preserved it because, I had connections to my great-grandparents on my mom's side at St. Stephen. I had connections to my great-grandparents on my dad's side at Our Lady of Good Counsel. And so I had, skin in the game for it. But I also had creative ways to raise a little bit of money. I can limit the numbers of masses, and people have to understand one priest can't be everywhere, and they were very, very good about that. But I think every situation is unique in this. I think if it's possible to preserve, and the Congregation for the Clergy while I was there was really allowing church closures to go on basically without question. Since then, they've started to change because they want you to say these are sacred spaces, and people get attached to sacred spaces where they were baptized, their parents were married, they received the sacraments. Sometimes it's just not possible economically to do it, but to preserve a sacred space is something laudable. It was consecrated for God's use, and to convert it to a profane or use or to tear it down is something that was usually done by roving bands of heretics who went and destroyed churches. And so we've fortunately been able to do it. I think we're in good shape for the future, but it's hard to extrapolate my experience and to use it as kind of a standard to look at another diocese that may have completely different circumstances than we do.
So you and your mom had the conversation that you could have been going to the least desirable parish in the Archdiocese of New Orleans when you came home, but then something happened, thanks to your hard work there, thanks to the buy-in of your parishioners and so many around, that St. Stephen's became a basilica. Talk to us about how that idea came to you, what the process was like, what's been the follow-through once you've been named a basilica. How has that changed the day-to-day life of the parishioners there?
Well, I think a lot of priests don't really think about, becoming a basilica. Being in Rome, you're around a lot of basilicas. I had that idea. And when I first walked into St. Stephen's, it's the second largest church in the Archdiocese. And I thought, maybe one day. But at the time, it was in tremendous disrepair. And I really couldn't attack the structural, architectural, maintenance issues first. I really had to deal with the people and to bring the people so that they would buy into it. So I would say my first 5 years were really working with the people, working with the Archbishop, getting the other churches open. The next 5 years were to restore the church, for which we had to raise a lot of money to get the church looking like a basilica should look. You shouldn't have a rundown basilica, and so that was about $7 million, and that was a challenge to do that. And then the process of becoming a basilica took a little bit of explanation on my part to the Presbyteral Council on what is a basilica, what does it mean. We had already started changing the liturgy because a basilica should be celebrating a liturgy that's very close to what is going on in the Basilica of St. Peter. And so, I started introducing Latin chant, Gregorian chant during Advent and Lent, and then gradually started adding more in. And now we do a full Gregorian Mass. And that is something that a basilica must do. We're supposed to have public liturgy of the hours. But ultimately, I have to say that was not being a basilica is not the end of the story for me. The purpose of becoming a basilica was to create more attention for the parish, to grow the people who would come to see it. But ultimately, and I'm hoping I can do this in the next couple of years, is with our resources, our financial resources, I want the church open all day. And in this part of town, I can't leave it open without somebody in there. So I have to be able to pay someone, not with a gun or anything, just a camera, a phone, and to be in the church all day. And that is already taking shape because in this Jubilee year, we've become one of the Jubilee churches. So we're starting to see a lot higher number of pilgrims who are going to come. And because we're a basilica, they can receive plenary indulgences through the Jubilee of Hope, but there are certain days when they can receive a plenary indulgence for visiting the basilica. And as that happens, we start to get more weddings, start to get more revenue, and I'm hoping within a year or two I can just hire basically a docent, someone who can learn the history of the parish. The basilica application we turned into a book. They can read that and get a pretty good overview of what the parish is like. It has all the architectural details, the history of the parish, and eventually, I'd like to be able. When I was a kid, I lived a block and a half from my parish, and I could just walk down the street and walk in the church. And I want that for St. Stephen's. So that was my ultimate goal. Plus, we have a very unique possible pilgrimage route. On one side of me is a special shrine to Our Lady of Prompt Succor, famous statue that Andrew Jackson prayed before the Battle of New Orleans. On the other side of me, we have a Blessed Francis Xavier Seelost. The cathedral is always open. The Ursuline Convent, which is the oldest convent in the United States, is always open. And so we're walking. You could walk from each of them. It'll take you a little while, but if we're open, you'd have this unique Catholic pilgrimage trail because you can drive around New Orleans and see a lot of beautiful churches, but very few can stay open all day. It's not safe for the church.
So while you were trying to serve the people of three parishes who had been very hurt by the initial closures that had occurred, and as you were then trying to rehabilitate a majestic church and go through the whole process of petitioning the Vatican to have it declared a basilica, you were given another role by the Archbishop of New Orleans to go to the seminary and teach canon law. How'd you fit that in? And I'd love to know how the teaching of canon law has helped you as a parish priest.
Well, they say you don't really learn something until you teach it. And so I had not been doing much in marriage in Rome. All of my work at the Congregation of the Clergy involved parishes and priests and catechesis and property. And so I had to shift back into marriage because I had worked in the tribunal for several years before I went to Rome. And so I had to learn the canons on marriage very, very quickly. I'll be honest, the day that I was asked to teach because the previous instructor for canon law lives in Baton Rouge. And he said, Nalty's home, he's right down the street, get him so I don't have to drive down from Baton Rouge every day. And so I made a meeting to meet with the dean at Notre Dame Seminary. And the day that I went for the meeting was the day that Archbishop Aymon was announced was going to be the new archbishop. And I walked into the seminary and they're setting up for the press conference. And Archbishop Aymon sees me and I knew him. And, we say hello, and I went, he's going to want me back in the tribunal. And so I walked in the dean's office. I said, I'll teach. And so sure enough, 2 months later, Archbishop Aymon says, I'd like you to work in the tribunal. I said, well, Archbishop, I've got these three churches. I got a school. I'm teaching the seminary. And so I did have to do a little bit of tribunal work for a while. And then at one point I said to him, would you rather me focus on the tribunal or the seminary? And he said, oh, definitely the seminary. So I used to tell my students exactly why I was teaching, to get out of working in the tribunal. And but what I didn't expect was that I got to know all of the young priests in our archdiocese. My class is required, and that has become a great blessing for me because although I'm not teaching anymore, if you're a pastor in a parish, it's hard to get to know the young priests unless they're assigned to your parish. I mean, you see them at the Chrism Mass, you see them at clergy conventions and that type of thing, but they all had to take my class. They know my sense of humor, and that's been a great joy for me. And you need to cultivate your relationships with these young priests because priests need priests too. Okay, I can't anoint myself when I'm on my deathbed. Okay, I can't hear my own confession, and so I'd like to have these guys on speed dial so that when the time comes, somebody's going to be there for me.
On the subject of priests and priests needing priests and things, you, I'm just going to tell everybody, are the champion of bringing priests together. that for the class of 1999 at the North American College, to which we're both honored to belong, every January you host on your family's property in rural Alabama, where you had your dad build you a chapel that could withstand a Cat 5 hurricane. You host us there for a kind of half retreat, half reunion every year, which we come together and we pray, and then we ask for advice from the guys, and we do so much more. Talk to us about what led to the chapels being built, and what led to your decision. Was it a no-brainer for you to just say you're going to make a commitment no matter how busy you are, including when you were working in the Vatican, flying home to the United States in order to be able to host all your classmates for a week? Talk to us about why that has been a priority of yours since the beginning of your priesthood.
It's kind of a funny story. My dad, while I was in seminary, my dad came to Rome, and he had a big old roll of architectural drawings, and he showed me that he wanted to build a house on our property there, because we had family buildings that we shared with our cousins, but he wanted to build his own house, and he showed me this plan of this house he wanted to make, and then I said to him, well, where's the chapel going to be? And he said, well, I thought we'd use the gazebo as a chapel. I said, well, no, I can see where the gazebo is. Where's the chapel going to be? And he said, you want a chapel? And I said, yeah, I'm going to be a priest. And so he said, I'll build you a chapel. And that building of the chapel kind of took on a life of its own, because a retreat place that I used to go to here in New Orleans, they had a bedroom above the sacristy that if they overflow at Manresa Retreat Center, one guy can stay there, and I had stayed there before. And so I said I wanted that in our chapel. Well, to do that, the chapel had to be tall, and then it had to be off the ground because it's on a hill where water would flow around. And so the chapel grew to be a lot bigger than I envisioned. But it's like that Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And there was even one time when the chapel was being constructed where I was kind of doubting, like, what is my presumption that I have my own chapel out in the woods in Alabama? And this construction guy was there at the place, and he said to me, which was true, because your family has a lot of property around here. I said, yeah. He said, it's good to give some of it back to the Lord. And that kind of cemented me that I was on the right path, because that's the only use of that building, okay, is for prayer. And when we go there, we reserve the Blessed Sacrament first thing, and it is a house of prayer. And my dad built it on faith. Just his son wants to build it, and I never would have envisioned that it would be so well used by us when we go over there. And there have been other uses too for some retreats and that type of thing, but obviously the most use it gets is when we go over there. And it is a house of prayer, and we pray together in there. We celebrate Mass together, hear each other's confessions in there. And so, what do they used to do when they built towns in old France? They built the church in the middle of the town, and the town would grow up around it. And so who knows what the future of this little chapel is, but it's well used by us, and that's important.
In an age of isolation, in which so many people become best friends of their devices, you have always prioritized priestly fraternity and bringing brothers together. What are some of the lessons that you'd communicate to priests of every generation about the importance of that? What fruits have you received? What fruits have you seen in others that can create a culture of fraternity that can overflow into the communion of the church?
You know, in New Orleans, we're a real melting pot, and so we enjoy the differences that we have. You know, there's something very unique about this city and the different people who've been in charge of it, the immigrants that have come in and have been welcomed. And you're right. Sometimes I feel like I'm too glued to my devices too, but that's just how people communicate these days. You know, you don't, but face-to-face time is so important. I think I learned that at a young age. I remember when I was in high school, maybe 14 or 15, and I'm talking to one of my high school classmates, and he tells me about his family bought these tables to use at the TV so that they can eat dinner watching the TV. And I thought, wow, that's a great idea. I bring that home to my mom and dad. I'm like, we get these TV tables and we can watch TV while we're eating. And my parents were like, there's not a chance. I mean, that's the time when you're face to face. And so, that, understanding from growing up how important our family dinners were, but then also in seminary, our dinners together, and then just the culture of dining in Rome, where you don't go in and out of a restaurant in 40 minutes. We spend 3, 4, 5 hours sometimes together at meals. And when you're with each other like that, you're beholding God's image, right? Each of us are made in the image and likeness of God, and screens are artificial. I think I probably use my screens mostly for communications, for texts and emails and that type of thing. But they're and I don't really watch TV, but it's face-to-face time with people where you're beholding another image of God, and where true communication can go on, because communication face-to-face is so much better than on telephone or even on Zoom. You're with someone, you're accompanying, and that's obviously a big part of being a priest, is accompanying people, being with them, whether it's in marriage preparation, whether it's in preparation for a funeral, whether it's preparation for any of the sacraments, or just walking with someone through the normal difficulties of life on earth.
If a 16, 17-year-old boy comes to you and says, Monsignor, I'm thinking that God might be calling me to be a priest, what advice do you give him?
Pray a lot, and make sure that you're sure. But then you try to get them on a path, right? And the path for me is serving at the altar, attending Mass more than just on Sundays, introducing them to, pray the rosary, get used to that, and then introducing them to the Liturgy of the Hours. But, always recognizing that it's God who's doing the calling and it's not you. And if your heart for the priesthood coincides with God's heart, then that is exactly where you should be. But it's kind of baby steps, I think, in the beginning is, what is your prayer life now? Like, how are you hearing? Do you see yourself as a priest? And what's your been experience? What drew you there? Sometimes you hear priests who became a priest because they felt pressure from their family. Is there pressure from your family? Is somebody, pushing you? My family never pressured me. I think my mom always wanted one of her sons to be a priest. I thought it would be my brother Kevin, because he's the good one. But it is so important to rely upon God, and that also comes from 26 years of being a priest, seeing how much throughout my time, especially as pastor here, how much I see God's hand in it, and more than just mine. Because when you're first ordained, I think you have a kind of Pelagianistic understanding of the priesthood. It's all about my efforts. And my first 3 years, I was a pastor. I was an associate where there was a hospital in our parish that was frequently used for emergencies. So any kind of accidents on the highways, and it was very rare that a week would pass without 2 or 3 calls at 2 or 3 in the morning. And I got to where I could just barely wake up and go to the hospital and do the anointing and come back. Sometimes I'd see my clothes over the chair and I'd go, oh, I must have been at the hospital. But then I would get notes from people, and the nurses would see me and say it was so important. And I thought, that was not my sparkling personality or intellect that showed up at that hospital. That was Jesus who showed up at that hospital. And that was so important for me in my early years as a priest, because it let me depend upon Jesus more, as opposed to thinking that I had to do it. Like as a lawyer, you're the one doing it. As a priest, God is going to do it. And I sometimes think that 90%, 95% of our jobs is just showing up on time, just to be with people. You see it in so many situations where there are disasters that the priests just go and get there, and your presence will be more important sometimes than anything you say.
That's a great way to finish our time together. Monsignor Christopher Nalty, it's been such a joy to have you on the Shepherd Circle Priest podcast today. imagine what it would be like if we had more priests like Monsignor Nalty.
Well, one maybe is enough.
There's room for at least one more. That's why the Lord Jesus asked us to pray to the harvest master to send out laborers for his harvest. So please join us in praying for shepherds after Jesus' heart, and encourage the young men you know who show signs of a vocation to ask Jesus in prayer whether he might be calling them to serve him, the church, and the world as ordained priests. Please check back next week for an interview with another hardworking priest in the Lord's vineyard. I'm Monsignor Roger Landry, and I've been delighted to be your host today on the Shepherd Circle Priest Podcast. Thank you, Monsignor Nalty.
Thank you, Monsignor.
Thanks again for joining us today. For more information about how you can join us in supporting our work with clergy and religious, go to napa-institute.org. May God bless you this day and always.